All right, so I think we're live. Are we live? It says we're live, but I don't see it on my other window. Oh, there we go. We're live.
Perfectamundo. Okay. I have the announcement ready for me to be able to send that off when we're ready for that.
All right. I mean, we're ready to. We can probably start now.
I'll go ahead and push the button.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a few viewers on YouTube, and expect probably a few more are going to trickle in, and we have two viewers here on Discord. I think we're ready to start. Do you want to give your opening spiel, Joker?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Joker, and I'm your host for this month's Atheists for Liberty event. We unfortunately didn't have an event last month, but are now bringing you a lecture and Q&A/debate surrounding positive and negative liberty. Taco, who usually live streams these events to his channel, is unable to make it, and the same is said of Atheists for Liberty's president, Thomas Sheedy. We'll miss them, but are hoping they can return for events in the near future. I'd like to thank Ruin of the Gods, who was able to make it in order to represent Atheists for Liberty, and it's time for him to take the floor.
Thank you. So, my question for the audience is, have you ever noticed that in political dialogue, you will quite often find two diametrically opposed political movements using similar rhetoric? Let us consider rights and freedoms, for example. In the United States, both Democrats and Republicans will be claiming that the other party is engaged in violating rights and freedoms that they themselves are fighting to defend, preserve, and even expand. For the purposes of this talk, I will be using rights and freedoms interchangeably, as in this context they mean the same thing. In his essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, Isaiah Berlin contended that when people speak of rights, freedom, or liberty, at least in a political sense, they are generally speaking about two fundamentally distinct concepts. He called these negative liberty and positive liberty. Now take care, these terms are not to be taken as value judgments. Negative does not mean bad in this context, and positive does not mean good. To put it in a broad sense, he defined negative liberty as freedom from coercion, and he identified positive liberty as the freedom to achieve your goals. In short, we have freedom from and freedom to. Now, at first glance, this seems to be a rather minute distinction. I mean, one could quite easily frame freedoms to as freedoms from, and vice versa. A right to health care could be characterized as a freedom from being left to suffer illness unaided. A freedom from government interference in how you choose to express your opinions can be characterized as a right to choose how to express your opinions, a freedom of expression. A right to bear arms can be considered a freedom from coercive disarmament, and a freedom from poverty can be called a right to basic necessities. As such, one might think that the freedom from and freedom to formulation is not really all that clear-cut. When Professor Berlin speaks of negative liberty, he is very specifically speaking of freedom from coercive force imposed on you by other people. He quotes Helvetius: "The free man is the man who is not in irons, nor imprisoned in a jail, nor terrorized like a slave by the fear of punishment. It is not lack of freedom not to fly like an eagle or swim like a whale." Negative freedom can be understood to be the sense of freedom that John Locke was speaking of, when he argued that freedom entails not being subjected to the will or authority of any other man. This sense of freedom is a freedom from coercion, from subjugation, from being compelled by others. In contrast, when Professor Berlin speaks of positive liberty, He is talking about a sense of being master of your own fate. The person that desires positive liberty is the person that doesn't want to be constrained by any outside forces. Understood in this way, where someone who speaks of liberty in the negative sense may identify someone as being free, someone who speaks of positive liberty may not share the same opinion. One may possess the freedom to go forth and purchase necessities, in the sense that no one is constraining them from doing so. But if they cannot afford food, are they really free to acquire it? One might be free in the negative sense to pursue their happiness, but how are they to do so when they are constrained by disease, obesity, addiction, or any other health-related malady? In socialist theory, this distinction is sometimes identified as a difference between formal freedom and effective freedom. Formal freedom involves the absence of interference, and effective freedom involves the presence of capability. Understood in this fashion, we are indeed less free than birds and whales with respect to our capacity to fly or swim. Is such a lack of freedom relevant, interesting, or important to the political life of human beings? That is in contention, as while this specific example of a lack of capability might seem clearly unimportant to political life, this is the sense of unfreedom that is being spoken of when someone claims that by requiring healthcare to be purchased on the market, a right to healthcare is being violated. Armed with this understanding of the two senses of freedom, we are now able to see that when applied, they take rather different shapes. The extent to which we seek to expand positive liberties quite often is the extent to which we shrink negative ones. It is to free some people from poverty and disease that many are taxed on their behalf. And the extent to which you are taxed is the extent to which your political right to your property has receded. It is to free the worker from an undemocratic work life that the socialist seeks to abolish private ownership of capital, which obviously takes the form of the complete revocation of the freedom to privately own capital. It is the freedom from drug addiction that the advocate of state-enforced sobriety believes himself to be fighting for, efforts that ultimately come at the cost of a certain degree of bodily autonomy. Similarly, expansion of negative freedoms comes at the cost of positive liberties. As socialist philosopher G.A. Cohen points out, upholding property rights protects the freedom of owners to use that property, but it also withdraws the freedom to use that property from non-owners. If we are to consider basic necessities, such as food and healthcare, to be one's own personal responsibility rather than a right, then we have upheld certain people's freedom to keep their own resources, whilst removing from others their freedom to access these resources free of charge. If we allow private individuals to form private corporations with hierarchical structures, it is argued that we have further shrunk a right to a democratic workplace, as we have contributed to the overall saturation of non-democratic workplaces. Consider the following. Do our freedoms to which we are justly entitled require facilitation by others? Or is a state of independence from any who seek to repurpose us or our resources for their ends not the entire point of liberty? Can those of us who are ostensibly more rational and intelligent constrain us from making choices that ultimately make us less free in their eyes? Is it not the case that to be maximally free, we must be prevented from making choices that we wouldn't have made if we had known better? Or is unconstrained choice itself fundamental to freedom, even if those choices might be harmful to others? Who deserves to be free? Many might be tempted to answer everyone, but it would seem that few truly would believe that answer, because upon reflection, it seems clear that anyone who poses a threat to one's personal theory of liberty is ultimately considered to be legitimately constrained by those who adhere to the theory. To embrace certain liberties as just necessarily entails understanding certain freedoms as unjust. One might see efforts to distribute resources from those who have more to spare to the poor, to the sick, the infirm, and the vulnerable as being an effort to better free the beneficiaries of the redistribution. As after all, how are you to exercise your freedom when you are the victim of circumstances that are beyond your control? To others, such efforts are nothing more than plunder, constituting themselves as infringements upon the freedoms of those from whom resources are extracted. In order to be free, shouldn't people be left free from theft? perpetrated by those who have appointed themselves as the arbiters of the distribution of other people's property. Ultimately, these two concepts of freedom clash due to the fundamental differences in the moral preconceptions of those who advocate for them. I believe that the bulk of the disagreement ultimately lies not merely in what actually are the freedoms to which we are entitled, but also in responsibility itself. Adherents to differing theories of liberty generally find a great deal of disagreement in what the overall field of our responsibilities are, and as such, it could be that therein lies the heart of the matter. And with that, I am ready to open up the room for questions.
All right. For the people in the live stream audience or the Discord audience, go ahead and type out your question. For the Discord audience, if you want to raise your hand and come up, ask questions or debate, both are correct. Do we currently have anything in the live chat?
No. I think I'll refresh the live chat though, just to see.
All right.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the live chat.
I mean, it was pretty straightforward, to be fair.
Yeah. Of course, I mean, obviously people can ask questions about the topic, or they can ask questions about other things as well, if they so choose and or prefer.
This was a fairly last-minute event, so I don't blame folks for not knowing about it.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because at the start that Muslim guy was raising his hand fervently, but then he couldn't wait until the end of the talk to actually...
He was messaging me to be dragged into the Arab room.
Yeah.
The Mystic Being, are you available?
Do you have questions?
He's actually very interesting to talk to, which is why I'm asking the question. I would wonder if he would have any questions or anything he'd want to debate. Oh, here we go.
Let's bring him on stage. I don't know how to do that.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Hello, the Mystic
Yes.
Being. How are you?
Hello, sir. How are you doing? I'm doing well. So, can you perhaps reiterate your point a little bit more? Let's concentrate on a specific thing. Do you tend to fall more on the aspects of negative or positive freedoms, in terms of your rationality?
So you're acting. So you're asking more about my personal views rather than about the
Yes.
distinction itself. I mean, because some could argue that the distinction isn't even a good one. Now, I personally think that there are certain points at which the distinction might fall apart, but I personally think that the fundamental issue at the core of the distinction lies in one's theory of responsibility, right? So I think that the field of our responsibilities does not extend beyond our agency, right? So ultimately, I don't think a person can be justly held responsible for circumstances that are outside of their control, that circumstances that they didn't cause. And because of that, I think that that actually changes the shape of liberty, because if I am not responsible for, let's say I'm a descendant from slave owners, right? If I'm not responsible for, and before I continue, I want to preface that these are my personal opinions. These are not the official opinions of Atheists for Liberty or anything like that. But I think that if you can't be responsible for the actions of people who were born and died before you were even born, then you simultaneously cannot be responsible for paying reparations for their actions. My ancient ancestors were Vikings, right? I don't think that I owe the descendants of the people of Northumbria reparations for their actions. And so because of that, I don't think that they can claim to have a right reparations. And so therefore I don't think it would be an infringement upon their freedoms for me to withhold those resources, right? So
Yes.
yeah, so ultimately I think that the concept of positive liberty fundamentally rests upon a more expanded view of responsibility. In order to uphold certain ideas that are positive liberties, I think you have to you have to have this theory of responsibility that involves circumstances that are outside of your control, right? So, for example, take for like a right to healthcare, right? I did not create the circumstance in which other people suffer from ailments. As such, I don't think it's, well, at least in a negative liberty framework, it wouldn't be my obligation or responsibility to remedy that circumstance. However, for someone who believes that everyone has a responsibility to everyone else, then it would be an infringement upon their just entitlements and therefore their rights and freedoms to withhold those resources from someone under a theory of responsibility that emphasizes personal action. Taking care of yourself is your own responsibility, whereas under a theory of responsibility that is more expanded, taking care of you is the entire community's job. So ultimately, I think at the core of the matter, positive liberty rests upon a theory of responsibility that is detached from personal agency. Furthermore, I think that negative liberty, I mean, let's think of ourselves as kings, right? So there are two fundamental characteristics of a monarchy, and that is power and sovereignty. Well, if in the context of liberty, I think that negative liberty corresponds to sovereignty, and positive liberty corresponds more to power, right? So positive liberty is more about the ability, the capacity for doing things, whereas negative liberty is more about whether or not you are in control over your domain, right? In the context of liberty, that domain is yourself, right? Are you in control over yourself? Do you and your possessions and so on and so forth? Versus, are you able to achieve some broader goals? Does that sort of, I guess, answer the question?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I would say when I think of the conceptions of positive freedom and how I interpret it, I think positive freedoms tend to correlate themselves to the actions of whether or not you're protected by what's the word? The encroachment of outside resources or like victimizations of your will. And I think negative freedoms tend to correlate themselves more to the physical aspect of it instead of the metaphysical, involving emotional or financial harm towards said individual. Would you agree with that or no?
I would sort of think that maybe you got those inverted.
It could be.
Yeah, because negative freedom normally involves more to do with your freedom from encroachment, right? Your freedom from coercion. Whereas positive freedom is more to do with what you have access to, right? What capacity you have. So I guess going back to the Helvetius quote, like, on the one hand, I'm not less free than a bird because, in the sense that, my ability to fly or not fly has nothing to do with anyone's coercion on me. Whereas in the positive freedom sense, I am actually less free than a bird because I cannot traverse space in the same fashion. I'm more constrained by nature. So that's sort of the way I think about it.
Yeah. So based off like these principles, do you believe it is the role of government to expressly try and protect either or both, perhaps, positive and negative freedoms to some extent? Or do you think that the government should perhaps be less involved within the enactment of freedoms upon its citizens?
Well, I ultimately think that the best, I guess, I like to take an idea and tensile test it until it breaks, right? Take it to its ultimate logical conclusion. And I think the ultimate logical conclusion of negative freedom is less morally repugnant than the ultimate conclusions you can arrive at by taking the positive freedom route. So yes, I personally lean more towards negative freedom.
And do you justify this based off like what specific aspects of negative freedom? Like what do you think is like the most important part of it that you believe is important for the government to protect, or the state, whatever?
Yeah, I think that the most important aspect of the person that the state is formed to protect is ultimately personal sovereignty. Your sovereignty over yourself, your sovereignty over your own, your ability to reap the rewards of your own efforts without threat of encroachment from anyone else. And this is because I think that if civil society is not to be joined into for the express purpose of protecting our lives, liberties, and property, well, then I ultimately think that it's a bad investment and that anarchy would be preferable. And because, why do we even enter into civil society? Are we not attempting to escape from the brutish state of nature in which just random marauders are just able to just plunder one another at will? I think it's to escape that plunder that we form civil societies. And then once these civil societies themselves merge into means of plunder themselves, I think that that's when they become a bad investment. They become the very thing that we were attempting to escape.
But of course you would agree you're not like an absolutist, right? There's certain ways in which the government perhaps has an ability to encroach on certain aspects of property. Would it be for the greater good of the society? So like, let's say eminent domain, right? With the ability of the government to retain or exercise its right to take away your property in exchange for equal value outside it.
Well, I think that we could take multiple different views of that. I'll sort of use a utilitarian argument, even though I myself am not a utilitarian. I do find sometimes these lines of reasoning to be useful. If the particular, I think that if the particular encroachment is necessary in order to preserve the overall freedom in society, then it could be justified. But if it reduces the overall freedom in society, then it wouldn't be, if that makes sense. So I don't think that eminent domain for the purpose of benefiting your buddies in the private sector who are sending you kickbacks, I don't think that that's a legitimate use of eminent domain. But I do think that eminent domain for a national security situation where like you need that location because of its tactical situations and you're dealing with an imminent threat, I think that could be useful. Like, I think that could be justifiable. Because, the entire point of us banding together is for the common defense. The problem is that ultimately the reasons why a society will do something will oftentimes get perverted, right? Oftentimes we will ostensibly do something for noble reasons while certain people end up benefiting. So it's corruption disguised as nobility, which I think is something to be vigilant of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you say yourself you're not a utilitarian, correct?
No,
or at least you don't propose that.
I would argue that I align more with virtue ethics.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that ultimately freedom is important because it actually enables us to better achieve eudaimonia, to better, be able to develop ourselves into without the kind of constraints that a more involved society would place upon someone, right? So oftentimes societies, particularly I think those that operate under a very positive liberty lens, will be more likely to try and guide the development of its people. But because the vision of the leaders is not actually a virtuous one, despite the fact that they believe it to be virtuous, what ends up happening is people's ability to develop virtue ends up being constrained by force of law. And that essentially stunts their ability to actualize, to like optimize their existence.
Yeah. So would you say that, I guess not what you say. For me, I view virtue as a very ambiguous term, if you will, because that could really shift depending on how you grew up within a certain society, right?
Clearly, very different people think different things are virtuous, which is what I think the very specific danger of trying to impose virtue is. I think that if true virtue exists and can be discovered, it has to be discovered by as many routes as possible. So you can treat each of your citizens as one specific, I guess, evolutionary experiment. And as each of them attempt to, like, treat the entire society as like a machine learning algorithm. And they're all different iterations, right? They're all trying to iterate to try to figure out the best life possible to them. Well, I think that those iterations are only made possible if people are maximally free. So I don't claim to know what perfect virtue is, but I think that by freeing people, what we enable them to do is essentially to function collectively as a large supercomputer in the effort to attempt to discover it. Does that sort of reasoning seem to jive?
I can understand it, but like, are you trying to say that? So you say for you, it's the goal of society is to strive to a higher level of virtue, or do you think?
Well, I think.
I guess I'm trying to understand that better.
Well, what is, I think, the purpose of human life? I think that we don't really. I think that it would be a complete waste of an opportunity for us not to try and make the best use of our existence, right? We only get, as far as we know, we only get this one shot at life, unless reincarnation is true. But even then, in reincarnation, we'd still want to maximize our existence, to best create, to refine our iterations. But even if we don't accept, an afterlife or reincarnation, well, I mean, in the absence of evidence for accepting such a thing, I think it's prudent for us to maximize our existence, right? To make the most out of it. And I really think that's what the whole project of virtue is developing the fitness, the capacity for truly and maximally enjoying your life. I think a courageous person is more fit, more capable of self-esteem than a coward, right? I think that it feels good. It feels good to be a just person and to revel in the dispensation of justice and to recoil in horror at the injustices that occur. I think that developing those sort of characteristics makes for a more fit kind of human being, a human being that is more suited for existing and for existing well.
But wouldn't you say that if you as an individual are trying to strive for this maximalist view of, like, let's say, utility, right, or of human happiness, sometimes that can interfere with the societal goal of progression to, let's say, safety or security or whatever else, right? So sometimes, wouldn't you argue that the pursuit of such virtues can often interfere with the societal goals of, like, safety or, let's say, progression into, let's say, economic.
It can certainly interfere with certain people's perceptions of what safety is, but I would challenge the arguer, or really anyone who would present such an argument, to create a safe society without courageous men, right? I think that such a thing cannot exist. A society of weak people, a society of people who are not who are unwilling to defend what they love, who are unwilling to arm themselves in the defense of that which they love. Well, such a society cannot achieve safety at all, especially in So I mean, on the one hand, I would argue that safety is actually not possible in the absence of these virtues. But also, furthermore, I don't think that virtue exists for the sake of safety or any of these other characteristics. Rather, the characteristics of your society exist such that your individuals, the people in that society, can best develop their own characteristics. Society exists for the sake of the individuals. The individuals don't exist for the sake of society.
I'm not sure if I'm oversimplifying your point, but would you say that this sense of virtue is echoed, like, of equal stance to the pursuit of honor? Or would you say honor is something different from the pursuit of virtue?
Well, it depends on what you mean by honor, right? Because
honor,
I mean, previous thinkers have talked about honor in multiple different senses. People have actually distinguished honor from virtue in some archaic senses, because they talk about honor. Like, for example, Thomas Paine talks about monarchies as honor-based systems, and he considers democracies as virtue-based systems, right? Where in a monarchy, you pursue honor in terms of, being lauded, in terms of being granted favors by your monarch, essentially. So you're currying favor from the monarch in order to succeed in society. Whereas in Thomas Paine's vision, a democracy, in his view, would be meritocratic. So virtue would ensure success in how people rise and fall. Now, people can debate whether or not that's actually played out. But so that's one sense of honor, right? I don't like using honor in that sense because I think honor is too beautiful of a word to be dirtied by people-pleasing behavior. So one could equate honor in this sense with virtue.
Mm-hmm. But I agree with you. Like, obviously those are two different distinct terms in how you pursue things, right? Yeah. But you say that you view society as something that you wish to pursue based off virtue instead of a utilitarian standpoint. But I suppose when you say you want to pursue it through virtue, you mean it in a more positive sense, in that you view it as a good thing for us to pursue virtue as a society. So in this term, would you?
Well, I mean, as individuals, actually, because my entire advocacy for liberty, actually, as I laid it out earlier, was that the reason why it's so important is because when we attempt to impose one particular vision of virtue, well, because we're human and because we don't have a perfect picture of what moral goodness looks like, quite often what we'll end up doing is we'll end up constraining individuals, preventing them from really best, through experiment, essentially, best figuring out the means by which they can flourish and pursue fulfilling and happy lives. So I actually think that virtue is better discovered personally rather than inculcated through an attempt to just ram it into people's heads. I think the virtuous is the chosen freely. You can never be made to be virtuous. You can never be molded into a virtuous human being.
Do you think the government in its functions should try and pursue, not necessarily push their personal virtue, but try and incentivize people to find their own personal virtue? Or do you think the government should not be involved in that at all?
I think the only thing that the government should be involved in is punishing the specific vicious behaviors between individuals that further impede their ability to maximally pursue happiness as they see it. Right. So, obviously, the murderer is someone who has removed from someone the ability to be virtuous or live a happy life or do any of the above. Right. And similarly, I think slavery, theft, all these other sort of encroachments that that people engage upon one another, that these are all means by which they, shrink the space available in other people's lives to really be free to figure life out.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So ultimately, when government is just, what it's doing is it's freeing people from such encroachment, so that they're able to discover what a fulfilling life looks like for themselves. Whereas when government is unjust is when it's engaging in the encroachment, when it itself has become the murderer, the thief, or the robber, when it itself has become criminal.
But would not the parent take on that role with their child, though? Like, would not a parent try and guide a child towards their own sense of virtue, and sometimes even encroaching upon the child's idea of virtue upon their personal self?
Of course. But that is because, I guess I'll think about it in the terms that John Locke used, which is that children are in a state of tutelage where they are clearly not fit to enjoy freedom, not fit to really be full members of civil society, because they're at such a premature stage that they require instruction. But that further hammers home the point, though, is that the relationship between a parent and a child is not civil society. Rather, the relationship between a parent and a child is a sort of mentorship, which is necessarily coercive to a certain degree. But I don't think that the government is the parent of its adult citizens. I think that the relationship between government and its adult citizens is, or at least it should be, a relationship of equals and of representation. a relationship in which, you know, we are engaged in our own government, essentially, for the well-being and preservation of our interests, of our ability to be free and to enjoy our freedom.
See, but would not, what's the word? You use the word tutelage, correct? In that the role of the parent is to teach the child into the ways of living through the world, correct? Because obviously the parent would probably have a better understanding of what it is like to live in the real world.
Yeah.
So if based off this premise, couldn't the government also take on that role with its adult citizens? Because
yes,
the government has
plenty of governments do. Right, plenty of governments have attempted to take on such a role, and I'd argue that in almost every circumstance it ends in disaster, because these adults who are in government do not actually know how to live than the adults who are under their care or in their charge, right? Whereas
does it not depend on the issue?
Say again?
Does it not depend on the issue? So let's say an expert in alcoholism could better tell an alcoholic how to recover from his illness, rather than someone who has no experience whatsoever.
Of course. I mean, that is, of course, the case. However, the alcoholic, I would argue, should not be coerced by government into giving up his alcoholism. I don't think that's the government's role. I think that it's up to the alcoholic to discover how to be virtuous. Because, ultimately, I don't think that there is any I don't think there's any paternal relationship between government and society. I don't think that there's any legitimate claim for the people to be considered to be subordinate to government. Rather, I think that government is created by people for the purpose of preserving their freedoms. And I think that whenever that relationship is flipped, when the sovereignty is taken from people and placed in government, what ends up happening is government almost always necessarily becomes tyrannical, even when it's operating under the best of intentions. I mean, with regards to alcohol, for example, I mean, the 18th Amendment, you know, we'll just completely ban alcohol, right? Completely take away that freedom from all the adults in society. You know, a lot of these sobriety movement people were using similar arguments that, sobriety is objectively better than being an alcoholic, which is true. That is true. But ultimately, what were the actual social impacts of this? I think the social impacts were that ultimately the society descended into lawlessness as pretty much no one observed the law. Because the law itself was contemptible. It was contemptible not because of the intent behind it, but because of the degree of control that it attempted to extend over the lives of its people. Ultimately, I don't think that there's any legitimate claim for government to dictate to you how to live. Whereas there is a legitimate claim for a parent to dictate how their child is to live, as long as their child is in their care. And I think that legitimate claim is the immaturity of the child. I think that it is the fact that the child was, they created that child, essentially. And so the child is, at least for the time being, justly under their authority, being trained to eventually become their equal.
Do you think a government can provide assistance to its citizens, be it not forced, of course, but like the opportunity to use the service provided by the government?
I mean, I do think that governments can legitimately provide services to their citizens. I think that's actually part of their role. I mean, defense is a service, and I think that the common defense is one of the reasons why we consent to live under governments. You know, if governments were useless for the common defense, we'd quickly replace that government because it would prove to be pointless.
So based off this idea of assistance by government, so let's say the government provides a welfare program that gives these alcoholics someone like a therapist to talk to about their alcoholism. Do you think that's a good role for the government to play, or do you think they should be completely out of that?
I'm personally very skeptical of the efficaciousness or even legitimacy of welfare programs. However, what I will say is that the system that you proposed is certainly better and less paternalistic than the system enforced by coercive sobriety activists for the 18th Amendment. You know, for example, it's like in the one case, it's the government simply offering help, and the other circumstances, the government attempting to force people to accept the help, essentially. So I do think with regards to coercion, one is better than the other. But, however, that help that's being offered, however, necessarily must be coercively funded from some other people. So you don't fully remedy the situation of paternalism there, because what you're essentially saying is, well, if you were a better person, if you were a more moral person, you would willingly, charitably give for the rehabilitation and assistance of these people. But since you don't take on that moral responsibility, we have to force you to by taxing you for their benefit, essentially. So it still is somewhat paternalistic, and therefore I think it still is objectionable within the framework of personal sovereignty versus state sovereignty.
So I myself, right, I tend to be more lenient towards the idea of welfare, because I feel like there's certain empirical claims to show like there's some type of positive impact it has on society. But I also understand that certain people have this idea of, you said negative freedom that you ascribe. Yes, certain people have this very carnal desire of negative freedom. So I understand why certain people may think like that. But I feel like the objective benefits to the people that are suffering from, let's say, poverty or alcoholism outweighs the negative freedoms given to these individuals who otherwise would be suffering for the rest of their life, even under said negative freedom, because they're losing out on a maximalist perspective, in my personal view, because they're not achieving their truest self to the most possible degree, or at least the maximalist degree of utility.
And so in order to enable them to achieve their truest self, we essentially take from those who are further down the line in doing so.
Yeah, these people who have suffered from the effects of society to a negative extent should be allowed to come back into society through the assistance of the government, be it paternalistic or not.
I disagree. I don't think that I don't think that the unfortunate necessarily possess any moral claim upon the lives, liberty, or property of the fortunate. Again, this is my personal opinion. This is AFL itself. The organization has a wider range of opinions. Actually, part of my talk I gave earlier was somewhat inspired by the conversations that I've had with a socialist member that we have. But ultimately, why I understand, for some people it's like, well, why should you be free to ignore the plight of others, right? That would be a way to characterize, overall, like summarize your question, mystic being.
Yeah.
Why should people be free to ignore the plight of others? And at first that sounds like a pretty compelling question, but I would caution you, because when you pursue that idea down to the blind alley at the end of its road, what this means is that we have a responsibility to anyone at all that is less fortunate than we do. That basically that responsibility does not just extend to fellow members of my society, but it would also extend to impoverished people around the globe. And that we are shirking, as long as someone else is less well off than we are shirking our responsibility. And I think the danger of this is that if we were to consistently apply that principle, prosperity itself would become impossible. Civilization would become unsustainable. Right? That is if we were to take it to its logical conclusion. I don't think I don't think our society truly can afford to provide welfare to every single person that is below the American standard of living. And I don't think that any one society truly possesses such a responsibility.
But I feel like if you look at examples, like let's say the polio vaccine, right? We've seen like these international organizations that perhaps don't have the same level of sovereignty as a government, affecting individual freedoms by forcing them, in some cases, to take these types of vaccines that is, in a utilitarian sense, a benefit to society as a whole, because you're getting rid of polio within a certain region, right? And then once you expand it to the entire globe, you have made a positive impact on the rest of the world, because certain diseases are now eradicated
Is the eradication
continuously.
of disease itself a inherent good or is an instrumental good?
I believe it's both.
See,
I
because
believe is
I don't think that we exist to be free of disease. Rather, I think that we try and be free of disease so that we can live happy and fulfilling lives. And I actually think that coercion itself, by its nature, runs counter to the goal of living a happy and fulfilling life. People are unhappy when they're being compelled and coerced. So I actually think that what you're achieving when you coerce people to do things for their own good in your eyes, what you're doing, I mean, assuming you're correct, which people have done that and have been incorrect, but assuming that you're correct about what is in their best interests and that they're just deluded about their own interests, right? Assuming the most charitable circumstance, still what you're doing is you're reducing, I think, the overall amount of moral goodness in the world by introducing more coercion.
So you're saying the moral coercion outweighs the
Material
the
benefits,
instrumental.
yes.
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 Okay.
Yes. I don't think that material circumstances are the end all be all in measuring goodness, right? I think that the good life is not necessarily. I don't think that a wealthy person necessarily lives a better life than a poor person. Rather, I think that
I agree.
Yeah, materially, they certainly do. If you only look at the material circumstances, however, the wealthy person might be a neurotic and deeply unhappy and unfulfilled individual because he has no friends, right? So it's ultimately, I think that there is a more dare I say, I mean, it's odd for an atheist to use this word, but dare I say, spiritual element to personal fulfillment than just material goods.
But would you not say that there's a certain I know you say you're an atheist, but a spiritual benefit in allowing these people to live a longer life than they would have otherwise? Don't you believe like a person not dying at the age of, let's say, 10 is empirically and even spiritually better than like dying from said disease?
Well, I mean, I do think it's better for people to not die so early from preventable diseases. However, I think that when we engage in acts of coercion on people for their own good, what we're doing is we're essentially we're perverting that that dimension, essentially, because what we're doing is we're introducing what I think is fundamentally inimical to human dignity. You know, we're violating their dignity as persons, right? Because I mean, I think a fundamental aspect of being a person is being free to choose. Right, being free to choose, and if you're free to choose, you're free to make mistakes, essentially. Now, does this apply when those choices affect others? No, which is why things like this can be really subject to debate. I think it might be legitimate to charge parents that neglect to provide necessary medical assistance to their kids. Like, I think it might be legitimate to coerce those people. Because, I mean, yeah, while their actions are not just affecting them, but we must be careful because I think that at the end of the day, that reasoning could be extended to other things. You know, I mean, there are certainly more authoritarian atheists out there who would definitely love to ban religion on the charge that it's child abuse, that parents are actually violating their children's right to free thinking by imposing their religious beliefs upon their children. And I think that such a line of reasoning is so fundamentally inimical to freedom, right? Because essentially what we're doing is we're creating the USSR, right? We're creating an oppressive state atheism that is attempting to mold people into what we view as virtuous by force. And again, virtue is never, you can never coerce people into being virtuous. Virtue is chosen. People choose virtue.
What I'm trying to understand from your perspective is you seem to have this very innate distaste for coercion through the government's enforcement of whatever action they do.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why I'm an atheist.
But I feel like you agreed, right, that we as a society have signed some form of social contract with this government to allow them to take our money, our taxpayer money.
Our social contract is not with the government. Like, I do not agree actually with that theory. I don't think. I don't think that we have a social contract with the government. If we could be said to have a social contract at all, it's with each other, and that the government arises out of that social contract. So the government is subordinate to the social contract, rather than us being subordinate to the government via a contract.
But we agree that we allow the government to exist based off like agreements with one another as people. So like when we make that agreement, I feel like that extends beyond just very simplistic protection of sovereignty to the military. I think when we speak of sovereignty, I think that expands beyond the military aspect of it, but more into the societal thing. I agree that there's a slippery slope when it comes to how far we let the government get away with certain things. But I also feel like just because we see a possibility in the future does not mean we cannot pursue something that to a lesser extent that could be a net benefit for everyone else.
So
I think you have a very...
I don't see the legitimacy in adopting a principle halfway, right? I don't think that logically makes sense. That ultimately,
but we live in a
if we were
democracy.
To operate off of a principle, we should have the courage of our convictions and follow that principle. If we truly believe the principle to be true, that is, then we should follow that principle as far as it takes us. Hence why I don't think... I think at any circumstance in which the government is essentially elevated to be the parent of its citizens is a circumstance that is inherently tyrannical and leads to tyranny, even if done with the best of intentions. Right now, I do think that really, whenever civil society is formed, or when we ban into civil society in such a fashion that extends beyond the common defense or extends beyond the preservation of our freedoms, what ends up happening is almost invariably to the detriment of those freedoms. Right. So I don't see any reason to be in civil society at all, if not to ensure that I'm free from warlords and marauders who are trying, and thieves that are trying to take what I have, whether it be my property or my life. And so ultimately, when the government ends up becoming that, morphing into that, while using propaganda, portraying themselves as attempting to do moral goodness, essentially, I'm plundering you for your own good. I'm constraining you for your own good. Well, then what we've done is we've simply escaped like a band of unsophisticated marauders in nature to a very sophisticated marauder in society. And then therein, I think society ceases to be civil society and really just becomes a state of subjugation. I don't think a slave really is in society with his master, even if his master is a kind one and is treating him like as a house slave and giving him, fancy clothing.
I think your perspective of it is very limited. I think you have a very niche idea of how the role of government in its paternalistic practices upon citizens. Because I think just because I go halfway on something does not negate the beliefs of what I pursue onto itself. Because I live in a democracy, right? And of course, maybe you're very anti-democracy. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm not anti-democracy, but one thing I'd caution you about is that I don't think democracy... I mean, would you consider democracy to be an end in of itself, or is it a means to an end?
It's a means to an end, I suppose. Because what you're doing with a democracy is you're collecting the voices of the people and presenting it towards the government through policies or the election of representatives or whatever else, right? It's the will of the people. So whenever you have an idea within said government, there's always an innate level of compromise that you're trying to gain when pursuing the functions of how you want the government to enact its laws.
I mean, democracies are fundamentally formed by negotiation, but what happens, though, when the majority negotiates amongst itself to enslave the minority, as has happened in most democracies? Because I would point you to the history of democracy, in which most democracies that have ever existed have been slave states. Like, actually, the very idea of a liberal democracy, a democracy where the people are free, is very recent. And I'd point out the fact that it only arose because certain thinkers like John Locke and Helvetius and Thomas Paine, they came up with these ideas of natural rights, personal freedom, so on and so forth. And so that fused with the ancient ideas of democracy created a kind of system that has a very different character than the democracies we see in the classical era. I mean, we still owe our heritage to them. There's no doubt about it. We owe the gifts of democracy to ancient Athens and ancient Rome, and even Sparta. Sparta was also democratic, despite also being a monarchy. Yes. But The point I'm getting at, though, is that without the idea of personal liberty, when we look at these democracies, I mean, I would argue one of the reasons why the Roman Republic ceased to be republican at all was because of its consent to slavery, its widespread use of it. Ultimately, the Roman Republic, after having conquered so many territories, Gaul, Hispania, Northern Africa, Greece, Sicily, all the Greek colonies in southern Italy, what ended up happening is there was such a huge influx of slaves that the plebeians just could not find work. So ultimately, they had no choice but to pledge themselves to some general or another who promised to give them land and, pay and food and armor and equipment and whatnot. So eventually, the legions became subordinate and loyal to these generals rather than to the Senate. And so the Republic ended up killing itself by way of slavery.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, even as recent as, the Confederate States, that's a slave society that's also democratic. So ultimately, the concept of people not being free, people being slaves, is fully compatible with democracy. And so really, which is more important, freedom or democracy? I think that a democracy only deserves to exist if it frees its people. But that's also because I think a government only deserves to exist if it frees its people. That the purpose of civil society is to preserve our freedom rather than to trample on it, because I don't see any other reason to engage in forming civil society if not to escape the depredations of marauders in the state of nature.
Yeah. To me, it sounds like you're not necessarily against the idea of certain paternalistic practices within the government. You're just against the possibility of it getting worse over time, which is it devolves further and further into an encroachment on freedoms of its citizens. Am I right?
Well, I mean, a certain like, let's say you're in an emergency and you have to requisition someone's vehicle for the purpose of preserving national security, right? Or you have to set up a missile battery on someone's farmland in order to intercept an incoming nuclear bomb, right? It's like, I think that those kind of encroachments are legitimate because, one, I mean, they're temporary, but two, or at least intended to be temporary, but then two, what you're doing is you're actually serving the entire point of that person even being in civil society, right? Which is preserving their freedom. You can't really be free if you have been subject to the blast effects and of a nuclear bomb.
Mm-hmm. But I agree with you. I think that the government should be able to set up a defense against anything that's like an emergency situation.
Yes, I mean, I think that emergencies are a fundamentally different circumstance. However, I don't think
I agree.
We should live in the standards of an emergency 24/7, which is interesting because if you notice, presidents have more and more now been declaring states of emergency in order to legitimize the use of new and assumed powers. This has occurred more and more the last 50 years. And
that's true.
That I think is fundamentally concerning because they're attempting to use the legitimate excuse of emergencies for potentially illegitimate circumstances.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think there's certain there's been an increasing encroachment on individual freedoms based off these more recent presidents providing executive orders that go oftentimes beyond their abilities or what was meant to be through the Constitution or the original creators of said Constitution, how they interpret it. But I think we just come from I would say I'm more of a positive liberty, right? I tend to skew towards the positive liberty aspect of it because I view poverty as an innately bad thing that the government should try and improve on an objective scale. But I think there's big disagreements between how we view the encroachment of paternalism by the government that shifts our perspective.
Be lauded for having a feeling of sympathy for people who are worse off than you, right? But my question to you is, where does that end? Why not this feeling, that is, but the attempt to use government force and coercion to alleviate poverty, because that's ultimately what you do. You have to tax certain people of resources to give them to others. And so, does that only extend to the impoverished in our society? Or does that extend to the sum total of the impoverished in the entire world? And if so, then why draw the line at wherever you draw the line, right? Whether that include the sum total of humanity or just a certain amount of people in society, or even there are some people who would argue that the attempt to alleviate poverty should extend only to members of civil society who have proven a willingness to improve their circumstances, right? Some people have tried to put like a moral standard on welfare, right? So it's like, oh, well, the people have to, are restricted from using their welfare bucks for buying like cigarettes or something, right? And so like, where do you draw the line at this sort of government assistance? Of course, ignoring, let's assume my objection that this necessity of plunder, right? Like, let's ignore that and only focus on, like, I guess, where the boundaries of that assistance should lie.
I think I'm trying to remember what specific thinker thought of this, but there was this principle of the luck-based aspect of poverty, in that sometimes certain people were just simply unlucky and they had been subjected to states of poverty because of something that was completely out of their control. I think it should, for me, I think that's kind of like not necessarily the limit, but maybe the start. I'm not sure, but like I think that's something that the government should definitely try and improve upon, because that person had no what's the word? He had no negligence in what his actions were in trying to pursue his day-to-day living. So I think it's the government's role to maximize that person's utility in the long run by giving him the resources to get out of poverty.
So where would you draw the lines, I guess, of negligence? Who is negligent, and why are they negligent? Would we consider the crack addict who's chronically homeless and mentally ill, would we consider him negligent? Or is he subject to circumstances beyond his control?
I think it depends on how that crack addict lived his life. But I know as the government, it's very hard to be able to tell whether this person obviously lived his life virtually or if everything he went through was completely of his own fault or whatever.
I mean, because
yeah.
This is the fundamental problem with central planning in general, is that we just don't have the data or the data collection methods available for evaluating every single person's personal life. And in order to achieve that level of fidelity, we'd have to have very intrusive and universal surveillance. We'd have to create the most totalitarian of authoritarian states.
I agree. Yeah.
Which is actually what I think is another one of the risks of adopting a paternalistic mindset there, is because what you end up doing is you end up necessitating that data collection means if you want to be accurate about it, right? If you want to be scientific and accurate about it, then you have to set up the proper data collection. But that data collection itself ends up diminishing freedom.
Yeah, that's true. It's just maybe I am more open to the ideas of like these free riders, these people who perhaps did everything based off their own fault, to be involved within my system in the long run, because I believe that the majority of people don't necessarily come from the idea of personal accountability for their impoverished situations.
Yeah, I see, and I don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical of this. Well, on the one hand, I think that in a free society, if you haven't found a way to provide for yourself, then that the responsibility for that can very well be laid at your own feet.
Agree. Yeah.
And obviously, one could then debate, does the United States pass muster as a free society? And that's a different discussion altogether, though. But I think ideally, one could definitely accept the idea that in a free society, more of one's responsibility lies upon oneself, rather than, I wouldn't blame an impoverished laborer in North Korea for being impoverished, because he's literally subject to communism. So it's that's clearly outside of his control. But in a society where you're free to contract work with an employer, to choose who to apply to, and to choose where you live and where you go, as long as you have that freedom of movement, I don't think that I really don't think it's all that difficult to at least achieve a bare minimum standard of living, especially if you have any worthwhile skills at all.
I mean, but aren't you making a presumption that the country that we're currently in now allows such freedom of movement? Because we live in a capitalist system where you're not really allowed to move from one place to another if you don't have the monetary funds to do such like movements to such a large scale, you know?
Yeah, now we're getting into the distinction between positive and negative liberty, because you certainly are allowed to, whether or not you can afford to. You know, it's in the positive liberty, if you can't afford to, you lack the capability, and therefore you can't. However, I would argue that even if you can't afford to, you do have two perfectly good legs. Of course, you could counter by pointing out that actually there are laws against walking on the median of the highway, and I'd agree that is a valid point, and that's an infringement upon the negative liberty of the people who are attempting to migrate. And I think that such laws should be repealed. People, I think, should be allowed to walk along the median of highways.
But I feel like you have to come from it in a rationalist perspective, right? You have to say, is it truly rational for me?
I'm sorry, I lost you. You must have gotten muted. Yeah, it looks like you.
Yeah, sorry. But yeah, sorry. I was going to say that through a rationalist perspective, it would make far more sense for me to stay where I am rather than risk walking across like a state that I don't know and that I have like no connection to, and taking the risk upon that because I live in a perhaps worse situation where I am now, you know?
No, I don't think that's more rational. Oftentimes the more rational course of action is to move. I mean, I chose to move from one location to the other because I didn't want to incur the time and monetary costs of a longer commute. And so I decided rationally that I wanted to move closer to where I work. If I got work in a different state, I would definitely wouldn't stay where I am. I'd move to that state. You're definitely muted. I don't know if you're talking or not. Hello? Yeah, I've definitely lost you.
Yeah.
Oh, you're back.
Sorry. I kind of have to go back and forth, you know. But I would say my final point here, because I have to leave, right? But my final point here is just that I think if you live in a state of poverty, and in that poverty you are suffering to such a large extent that you need to make a change in your life, then sometimes you do have to take these very like extreme decisions to improve your life. But I just don't see why the government, in its role and its capabilities, shouldn't try and improve these people's lives and try and change it for the better. But well, I understand that you have a very risk towards paternalism.
I mean, there is an avenue by which people who are generally poor oftentimes do choose to improve their lives. And that is, they choose to serve the Republic. They join the military. A significant amount of people I met during my service were from trailer parks or from the hood and whatnot. And ultimately, they escaped from their circumstances and from where they originated by deciding that they were going to serve their republic. They were going to serve their society. I think that is a perfectly legitimate course of action, and it is the noble and virtuous one. You know, and I think instead of just expecting people to like give people resources without expecting anything in return, I think it's far more rational to be like, we'll help you out. We'll improve your circumstances if you give something, if you offer services in return. And helping defend the nation certainly is a form of doing that. So, yeah, I think that the military is one of the best employment programs actually in the United States. In particular, enlistment is one of the best ways by which people who originate in poverty end up becoming upwardly mobile, because oftentimes in the military they learn valuable skills that then they can market on the civilian market. This isn't always the case. I mean, a GI generally will have less marketable skills than someone who became an aircraft mechanic, but ultimately it still allows them some avenue of employment. And at the very least, the GI can get out and be a security guard or something, or a police officer. You're muted again, by the way. Hello?
Sorry. I know this is kind of annoying, but I just kind of go in between something. But yeah, I see what you're saying. I see the government can provide opportunities for these citizens to make a living for themselves, even when they're at points of like extreme poverty through like employment of like the military or whatsoever. But I just don't think that goes far enough, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, someone could definitely challenge that by being like, oh yeah, well, because that option, that avenue isn't available to people who are like crippled or disabled or something like that, and that's the point taken. But ultimately, while my sympathy definitely goes to people who have disabilities, I don't think that the possession of some form of disability necessarily translates onto an obligation upon anyone else to necessarily do anything about that. Because again, if we were to take that principle to its logical conclusion, then anyone in the entire world who is less well off than anyone has a claim upon the lives of those who are more happy or prosperous than they.
Well, I have to go, but I think this was a good, productive conversation.
Yeah, thanks for chatting. And honestly, I'd be happy to have you on in future circumstances where we can chat about these things. I mean, because you definitely provide a good arguments, good concerns to some of the overall principles I'm attempting to lay out. So,
Mm-hmm. I hope we can have further discussions. I think you're a rational human being, right? I think we can have a civil conversation about philosophical differences, but I hope we can have that in the future, though.
Oh yeah. Well,
have a good one, man.
Thanks for coming on, Mystic Being.
Yes. Have a good one. Wait, what's your name? Your name is
Ruin of the
God.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel.
Nice.
Subscribe if you're interested.
Okay. See you, man.
See you. So, do we have any further questions? Members of the audience, if you'd like to come up onto the stage, you can raise your hand. Hey, Joker, you there? Are there any further questions? Does anyone want to have a conversation? All right. Well, this has been fun. This has been an interesting conversation and whatnot. Ultimately, I'm grateful to the few who chose to attend, and ultimately, I wish everyone a good day. I'm going to end the event and the live stream now.